President Trump's new tariffs are about to hit your wallet so hard that your next iPhone, your kid's Halloween candy, and even a basic car seat could suddenly feel like luxury items. Because when you slap 145% tariffs on Chinese goods and a 10% tax on almost everything else we import, prices don't just go up a little, they explode. I'm Brian. I've worked in fintech and banking for decades. I've got a finance degree and an MBA. And in this video, the goal is simple. Translate all the jargon, all the tariff numbers, all the Federal Reserve research into one thing: what this actually means for your budget in the next 6 to 12 months. You're going to see how we get from 145% tariff on China on a news headline to your family pays roughly $4,400 more per year in real life. And by the end, you'll be able to decide whether this is smart economic strategy or a very expensive experiment that you're funding out of your own pocket. So let's start with what just happened, because the headline number, 145%, sounds fake. During the campaign, Trump talked about a 60% tariff on Chinese imports and a 10% universal tariff on the rest of the world. That alone had economists warning about a serious inflation spike. In office, that 60% idea effectively escalated into a combined tariff burden on China that reaches around 145% on many categories once you stack the base tariffs, additional rounds, and targeted measures on top of each other. On top of that, there's still a 10% tariff that broadly hits almost all imports from other countries. Then you've got the add-ons. There's a 25% tariff on things like autos, steel and aluminum, and additional measures that affect goods from Mexico and Canada, unless they qualify under trade agreements. When you blend all of this together, the China tariffs, the global 10% layer, and the sector-specific tariffs, the effective average tariff rate on U.S. imports rises into the mid-20% range, roughly the highest level the U.S. has seen since the early 1900s. That's not a minor tweak in trade policy. That's a structural shift in how expensive foreign goods are allowed to be. Now here's the brutal part. Tariffs don't stay at the border. They sneak into everything you buy. Most of what you use daily, even things with "Made in USA" on the label, include imported parts. Even if the final assembly is American, the components often come from China, Mexico, Canada, or Asia. When those parts get hit with tariffs, the cost rises for manufacturers, then wholesalers, then retailers, and everyone along the chain adds their markup on top of that. So a 25% or 60% or 145% tariff at the border can translate into a surprisingly big jump in the final price you see on the shelf. Let's make this painfully real with some examples. Start with smartphones. Around 80% of smartphones sold in the U.S. rely heavily on Chinese manufacturing or components. When those inputs get hit with extreme tariffs, you don't just get a $30 bump at the Apple Store. Under aggressive tariff scenarios and full pass-through, the effective price of a high-end flagship phone can jump by hundreds of dollars. Think an extra several $100s slapped on top of a device that was already expensive. That's the kind of increase that turns an upgrade from annoying but doable into, "I'm going to ride this old phone another 2 years." Gaming consoles are even more shocking once you run the math. When you take a device that is heavily imported or assembled abroad and layer high tariffs on key components, the cost structure changes dramatically. A console that retails for a few $100s can, under extreme conditions, behave like it wants to be a $1,000 device by the time tariffs, import costs, and retailer margins are fully baked in. You might not see a price tag literally over $1,000 overnight, but you will feel stripped-down versions, fewer discounts, and special editions that quietly normalize much higher price points. This doesn't stop with fancy electronics. Take something as boring and essential as a child car seat. When you tax the plastic, the metal parts, the fabric, the locks, and the foreign manufacturing that goes into these products, the price can easily jump from a relatively affordable figure into something that feels ridiculous for new parents already stressed about costs. What was a $60 or $80 item in a pre-tariff world can quickly behave like a $150 plus product after tariffs, freight, and markups ripple through the system. And then there's everyone's favorite test case, Halloween. Many of the cheap seasonal goods, Pumpkin carving kits, plastic decorations, costume accessories are imported. When those are hit with tariffs, importers either eat the cost for a while or they do what businesses always eventually do, pass it on. You see fewer $4.99 impulse buys and more, $9.99 or $14.99 tags for the exact same plastic junk you bought last year. Candy is a double hit. Not only are some ingredients and packaging imported, but sugar and other inputs have their own pricing issues. In recent years, candy prices have already been rising at multiple times the general inflation rate. Now add tariffs to the mix, and you get another leg up in costs right before major holidays. Shoes, clothing, basic electronics, household gadgets. All of these categories lean heavily on foreign production, especially from Asia. When tariffs climb into double or triple digits on certain suppliers, businesses don't suddenly move factories overnight. They keep buying from the same places while slowly trying to diversify, which means for years you get stuck paying the price of the tariff experiment. The result is simple. Your cheap fast fashion sneakers and discount store jeans begin drifting closer to mid-tier prices, and mid-tier brands drift toward premium territory. Now let's zoom out from individual items to the big picture: inflation. The Federal Reserve and researchers at regional Fed banks have actually modeled what happens when you stack tariffs this aggressively. When you add a 25% tariff on some neighbors, plus a 10% tariff on China, the research suggests that alone can add roughly half a percentage point to almost a full percentage point to the core inflation rate. When you move to a more extreme scenario, like a 60% China tariff plus a 10% global tariff, the estimated impact jumps into the range of more than 2 full percentage points added to core inflation. And remember, that's core inflation, excluding food and energy, which are already volatile. Now layer on what's actually happening in this scenario. Very high effective tariffs on Chinese goods, up to that 145% combined burden, and a 10% layer on many other imports. That kind of shock is large enough to push annual inflation meaningfully higher than it otherwise would have been. Translating that into household terms, analysts estimate that a tariff regime like this effectively functions like a multi-thousand-dollar tax on the average family. Around $4,400 per year in higher costs once the dust settles. That doesn't show up as a line item on your tax return. It shows up as, why is my grocery bill insane? And how did back-to-school shopping get this expensive? Here's where it gets even uglier for interest rates. The Federal Reserve sets rates based on inflation and growth. If tariffs are expected to add, say, 0.5 to 0.8 percentage points to core inflation under one scenario, and as much as over 2 percentage points in a more extreme scenario, the Fed suddenly has far less room to cut rates. Even if the job market weakens or growth slows, persistent tariff-driven inflation gives a central bank a strong reason to keep rates higher for longer. That means higher credit card interest, higher mortgage rates than we'd otherwise have, and more expensive car loans. Tariffs hit you at Target, then again on your credit card statement. Now combine inflation pressure with growth risks. When imported goods get more expensive, demand can cool, businesses delay investment, and trading partners retaliate with their own tariffs. Economic models from major banks and research shops have been flagging a much higher probability of recession under aggressive tariff regimes. Numbers in the ballpark of a 60% chance of recession under certain scenarios. That doesn't guarantee a downturn, but it tells you this is not just noise. We're playing chicken with a potential slowdown while prices are being pushed up by policy. So who gets hit the hardest? This is where things get really unfair. Lower-income households spend a much larger share of their income on goods, physical stuff, rather than services. Think groceries, clothes, shoes, household supplies, kids' items, electronics. Those are exactly the categories that are most exposed to tariffs because they're heavily imported or use imported components. Wealthier households spend more on services, travel, tuition, healthcare, dining out, so they feel the pain, but as a smaller share of their total budget. That's why economists say tariffs behave like a regressive tax. On paper, we're hitting foreign companies. In reality, the policy leans hardest on families who have the least flexibility. When Walmart, Target, and Amazon face higher costs on the goods they import. They can only eat that cost for so long before raising prices. Some brands might shrink package sizes, cut quality, or reduce promotions, but eventually it all circles back to the consumer paying more for less. Small businesses have it even worse. They don't have the scale to negotiate better deals or absorb cost spikes, so they either raise prices or go under. And this is just the domestic side. Once you start slamming 145% tariffs on a major trading partner and 10% across the board, you're not just playing offense. You're provoking a response. Other countries can respond with their own tariffs on U.S. exports, things like agriculture, machinery, autos, and branded goods. That means U.S. farmers, manufacturers, and exporters suddenly find their products more expensive abroad, lose market share, and in some cases, see contracts evaporate that took years to build. That's how tariff wars escalate. You tax them, they tax you, and eventually both sides, consumers and workers, suffer. Trump's pitch is reciprocal tariffs. If they tax our stuff, we tax theirs. In theory, that sounds fair. In practice, it can spiral. Once everyone matches everyone else's tariffs, the world just ends up with higher prices, more uncertainty, and slower trade. Big companies can move supply chains around over time, but workers in specific industries can't just pivot overnight. You can't tell a soybean farmer or a factory worker, hey, your export market just collapsed, but don't worry, we're reshoring in a few years. Bills are due now. So where does that leave you, sitting at the kitchen table with your budget? Start imagining your monthly expenses with a 2 to 3% higher inflation rate than we could have had without aggressive tariffs, on top of whatever baseline inflation is already doing. Take your rent or mortgage, your groceries, your gas, your phone bill, your internet, your kids' clothes and supplies, your debt payments, then add thousands of dollars per year of extra costs spread across all of that. That's what the $4,400 per household estimate really means. It's death by 1,000 cuts, not one big dramatic bill. Here's the irony. All of this is being sold as a way to protect American jobs and rebuild American manufacturing. And in the very long run, if companies move factories back, if supply chains truly rewire, maybe some sectors do see more domestic production. But in the short and medium term, before any of that fully materializes, the cost is paid by you. Higher prices, elevated inflation, less room for rate cuts, and a higher risk of recession. You might end up paying more now and still facing a weaker job market later if growth stalls. So when you hear 145% tariffs on China and 10% tariff on almost everything else, don't treat it like abstract political noise. Treat it like a line item in your future budget. Your iPhone upgrade, your kids' Halloween candy, your next pair of sneakers, your streaming devices, your laptop, your car parts, all of them are being pulled into a giant experiment in tariff-driven economic policy. Trump says this is how you bring jobs back and get tough on trading partners. Maybe in the long run, parts of that vision play out. But in the short run, the math is brutally simple. Prices go up, inflation gets a new floor, the Fed stays cautious, and the average American household ends up paying roughly $4,400 more per year for the same life they're already living. And with recession odds elevated, there's a real chance you're not just paying more. You might be paying more while worrying about your job too. I'm Brian, this is Finance Clarified, and the whole point of this channel is to take big confusing money stories like 145% tariffs on China and show you exactly how they land on your credit card statement. If you want more breakdowns like this, without the political spin, just the numbers and how they hit your wallet, make sure you stick around because this tariff story is just getting started. Subscribe to Finance Clarified so you don't get blindsided by money news like this again. New videos every week breaking down tariffs, inflation, interest rates, and market chaos in plain English, so you know exactly what's happening to your money before it hits your wallet.